Thank you, Ben, for the songs that you selected this morning. I think you may have noticed that the theme of our study this morning is going to be faith. And that's because about 2,600 years ago, there was a day in which a watchman was standing to his post and was considering the wickedness that he saw in Judah. And so he cried out to God concerning the violence and the iniquity and the strife and the injustice that he saw around him in his nation, and was wondering why God wasn't doing anything about it. Well, God graciously answered the watchman and gave him an answer that he was not expecting. He told him that he was going to use a violent and idolatrous nation, Babylon, to take care of the problem of the sinfulness of his people. And this confused the watchman, because he was wondering how a righteous and holy God could use such a wicked nation to judge his own people. And God gave him a beautiful and hopeful and prophetic answer in the book of Habakkuk. And so I want to read that passage again that Christian read for us a moment ago, because it's such a beautiful passage and it has tremendous import for us. Habakkuk, after expressing his concern to God about using such an evil nation to judge, in his view, a nation more righteous than they, and of course God straightened that out. But he said, "I'll stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am corrected." Then the Lord answered me and said, "Write the vision and make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it will speak, and it will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. Behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith." If we look at the context of Habakkuk and see the setting of this statement of God, that the just shall live by their faith, he points out in chapter 1 at verse 7 that the Babylonians are a terrible and dreadful people. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. Down in verse 10 or verse 11, it's the second half of the verse, he says that he commits offense, the Babylonian, ascribing this power to his God. So this is the setting for God's statement, "Behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him." That's the Babylonian, living by their pride, trusting in their might. But God points out that the righteous will live by their faith because they trust in God's might. And that's how they will be able to endure the coming judgment. Now, in some of your Bibles, if you have an NIV or an ESV, you might have noticed that the passage reads a little differently. It'll say something along the lines that the righteous will live by his faithfulness. And that's because the Hebrew word there for faith, emunah, can be translated faithfulness. Just as the word that is just, the word for just there, can be translated righteous. In Hebrew and in Greek, just and righteous are the same word. But here, the Hebrew word for faith can mean faithfulness, and it's used occasionally in that sense. We won't take time to look at it, but if you're taking notes, Psalm 36:5, Psalm 37:3, and Psalm 40 verse 10 are examples of this same Hebrew word being used and translated faithfulness. That's the same in the Greek too. When the Septuagint was translated, the Greek translators looked at this passage and understood that in Greek, the same word can mean faith or faithfulness. And in fact, there is a Greek word that specifically means faithfulness, but the Septuagint translators chose not to use that word. They used the word pistis, which is commonly almost uniformly used in the New Testament to render faith. Only about twice, as I recall correctly, the word is translated faithfulness, and it can mean that. But almost uniformly in the New Testament, pistis is used to render faith. But really, there isn't any difference in the statement. The just shall live by his faith, the righteous shall live by his faithfulness. Because as I mentioned, to be just is to be right. When God justifies you, he declares you to be right. A justified person is found to be right. And faith is demonstrated by one's faithfulness. By faithful living, by faithful obedience, we demonstrate our faith. So either way, the meaning of the passage doesn't change at all. Whether it's the righteous shall live by his faithfulness or the just shall live by his faith, the point is clear, and the point is not changed by that. But that was 2,600 years ago, as I mentioned. So what does this mean to us today? Why do we look at this passage? One reason is because it's quoted 3 times in the New Testament. If we assume that Paul wrote Hebrews, then this was one of Paul's favorite Old Testament quotes. He quotes it in Hebrews, if he wrote Hebrews. He quotes it in Galatians, and he quotes it in Romans. So we're going to look at those 3 quotes and see the emphasis that is found in each of those quotes and see if we can extract from those today why this passage is so important to us. First of all, in Hebrews chapter 10, if you will turn over to chapter 10 of Hebrews, beginning at verse 36, we see the first of these 3 New Testament quotes of Habakkuk 2:4. Hebrews 10:36, the Hebrew writer says, in the context of Christians enduring persecution, said, "You have need of endurance so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith. But if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who draw back to perdition, but of those who believe to the saving of the soul." Now, in looking at these 3 quotes, and we'll see the next 2 in a few moments, one of my conclusions on this is that in the Hebrew passage, we're having faith explained for us. The just shall live by faith. What kind of faith? What does that mean? Or if we want to render it, the just shall live by his faithfulness. How is that faithfulness demonstrated? What is involved in that? Well, look at the context again, and look what the Hebrew writer is emphasizing here as these Christians are going through persecution, just as the Israelites went through the persecution of the Babylonian siege and captivity, along with the destruction of Jerusalem. He says, "You have need of endurance, so that after you've done the will of God, you may receive the promise." And then in verse 38, he says, "The just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him." Verse 39, "We are not of those who draw back to perdition, but of those who believe to the saving of the soul." So from the immediate context, it's a faith that endures. It's the faith that remains consistent no matter what the faithful one is enduring. And if we look in chapter 11, which immediately follows this prequel, this setup for it, the Hebrew writer explains what kind of faith he's talking about. It's the faith that obeys. It's the faith that does what God commands, whether his command is understood or not, whether it makes sense to our finite minds or not. The faith demonstrates his faithfulness, the faithful demonstrates his faithfulness because he's doing what God says to do. So in Hebrews, the picture of faith that the Hebrew writer is giving us from that quote in Habakkuk is an enduring and obedient faith, a faith that works the works of God. The second quote that we'll look at is in Galatians 3. And in Galatians 3, verse 11, I believe Paul here is highlighting what it means to live by faith. What kind of life, what kind of living are we emphasizing here? Paul in Galatians 3:11 says that, let me start up in verse 10 to get the context. It says, as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse, for it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. But that no one is justified by the law in the sight of God is evident, for the just shall live by faith. That's the evidence that no one is justified by the law, because that's not the bottom line. God said the just will live by faith, not by the works of the law. And so what is Paul getting at here? As we read verses 10 and 11, you notice two Old Testament quotes. The first is from Deuteronomy 27, verse 26, and the second one from Leviticus 18, verse 5. And what Paul is doing here is contrasting living under the law or obtaining life under the law, and we're talking about spiritual life here. Being able to live by the law and being able to live by faith, what kind of life that gives us. Paul tells us that there's a curse on anyone who does not continue in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. So in order to obtain life under the law, you had to do all the law. Over in James chapter 10, for example, or chapter 2, at verse 10, James said, whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he's guilty of all. So to live by the law, to have the law provide spiritual life for you, to be found righteous in God's sight under the law, entailed living it perfectly. Well, of course, no one could. All you had to do was trip up once, according to James and according to Deuteronomy 26, and that's all it took. Now you were cursed. You were guilty before God, and He provided a way to correct that through the sacrificial system of the Old Covenant. But you're guilty now. From then on, you are having to offer sacrifices because now we're weak to sin. But if we go on in James 2:11 here, he says, he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you've become a transgressor of the law. In other words, not only do you have to keep the law, but you have to keep it perfectly. There can never be a mistake. So spiritual life, Paul says, is not found in the works of the law. That was not possible. And God designed the Old Covenant to show that to us, to demonstrate that by your efforts, you cannot live before me. You will not succeed. So God had to provide another way, and that is the spiritual life, the perfect life, the obedient life that is found in Jesus Christ. Go back for a moment to Hebrews 5, verses 8 and 9, where the Hebrew writer touches on this. He discussed here the suffering and the sacrifice of Jesus. And in verse 8 he says, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And having been perfected or made complete, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. What does it mean that Jesus learned obedience? Why did the Son of God need to learn obedience? He's perfect. He lived the law perfectly. Because of his obedience, by his righteousness, we can be found righteousness. His perfect life is applied to us by the grace of God, so that we can stand and be justified, be made righteous in his sight. But what did it mean for Jesus to learn obedience? Because he was obedient. Here is the Word of God, who was with God and who was God, according to John 1:1. John 1:14 says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Well, in living a life here on earth, Jesus subjugated his will to the Father. He learned obedience from our point of view. He learned what it meant to be submissive always and in all places and at all times, never contradicting the will of the Father, never ceasing to fulfill it. So he learned obedience by the life he lived here, by the suffering he went through. God hadn't physically suffered before. That was all experienced for the first time when God came in the flesh and gave his body for our sins, shed his blood. It's in that perfection that we're able to live. And so we come to our final quote of Habakkuk in the book of Romans, chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. And here I believe Paul tells us who the just are. We've already seen what kind of faith is being referred to here that the just person will live by. We've seen what that life is. It is spiritual life today for us in Christ. But now, who are the just that Habakkuk talked about? Well, in Romans 1:16, Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also for the Greek. For in it, the gospel, the righteousness of God has been revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. Well, the context, again, if we look at what Paul is saying, we're told who the just are. Because he says that in the gospel is the power of God to salvation for everyone who what? Believes. Everyone who believes, the Jew first, and also the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it's written, the just shall live by faith. The just is the one who believes. We've also seen that that belief, that faith, motivates obedience. That faith, that belief, obeys. It trusts God and does what he says. So, what's the application for us? Hopefully we've kind of given a foundation of what God is getting at in this statement that's found 4 times in Scripture. The just shall live by his faith. How does that help us today, and how should we understand that? Well, in light of the teaching that has been given to us for centuries now, and that is very popular in the world today, I think it's important to understand that this is a faith that is not alone. The Bible tells us that salvation is not by faith only. That phrase is never used in Romans, which is often referred to when someone says you're saved by faith alone. You're just, all it takes is faith. James tells us in James 2:24 that a man is justified by works and not by faith only. Well, that is a clear and concrete statement in Scripture. And so when I see statements like that, I like to listen to what people are saying in regard to that statement to see how they're going to argue around it. Because what they're trying to do is to say, James says we're not saved by faith only, but we are. He doesn't mean that we're not saved by faith only. And so they have to clarify or correct or reason their way around that statement. One of the problems, I think, is something that arose in the mind of Martin Luther back during the Protestant Reformation, when a recognition was finally given that you are not saved by works, the kind of works that he saw as a priest in the Catholic Church, going through all of these rituals day after day and month after month, year after year, all of these things that the priests prescribed for us to do. He saw in Romans that Paul said we're saved by faith. The just shall live by his faith. Unfortunately, I believed he saw that and contrasted that to all the works that were being given to obtain God's grace and favor, and swung to the complete opposite extreme. Because he looked at Paul's statement and saw faith only. The just shall live by his faith. And since Paul stopped there, that's all he meant. Just faith. When Luther got to James, and of course he was aware of James, he really struggled with that. How do you reconcile Paul with James? Because in Ephesians 2:9, Paul said a man is not justified by his works. But James says you are saved by works. So Luther solved the problem by putting James last in his German translation of the Bible. I'll just make it so it takes him a while to get to that. James came after Revelation in the Luther Bible, because that bothered him. But I think, my own conclusion is, first of all, the Bible does not contradict itself. That's where we have to start in this situation. Paul and James are not going to speak against each other. You don't have one saying one thing and the other saying the opposite. If that's the case, and I believe that it is, God's word is consistent, then the only obvious conclusion is that they're not talking about the same kinds of works. Paul says you can't be saved by works. Got that. James says you're saved by your works and not faith only. Got that. Because we need to understand what kind of works Paul and James are talking about. In Romans and in Ephesians and in his writings where Paul talks about works, he's talking about human works. He's talking about the works of the flesh. He's talking about works that are required to, for the Jew, obey the old covenant, which you can't do perfectly. So those works don't avail. James is talking about works that God gives us to do. If you read the context of chapter 2, he gives us the examples of Abraham and Rahab and these stalwarts of the faith, and talks about what they did based on that faith, how their faithfulness demonstrated their faith. And so he can say we're justified by works. He explains that farther up in the chapter when he says, "Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works." If you're not doing what God commands you to do, there's no faith there to demonstrate. If you're doing what God says to do, James says, by obeying what God says to do, I'll show you my faith. My faithfulness will demonstrate that. My obedience to God will bring out my faith to full view. So, faith without works, as James says, is dead. It's alone. But that I believe is the fundamental difference. We need to make the proper determination what are man's works and what are God's works. If God hasn't commanded it, then it's our work. If I can hold up something and say, I'm going to do this, and bring it before God and say, look how well I did that, God, now you owe me something, That kind of work can't save. That's my idea. That's my invention. That came from my wisdom and my effort. But when I do what God tells me to do, He says, Kurt, do this. So I go do that. What work have I have accomplished? And have I earned my salvation in doing what work God said to do? Jesus said, after you've done everything, consider yourself a weak and unprofitable servant because you've only done what was commanded you, nothing more. So you haven't earned any brownie points. You just did what I said to do, and you did it well. That's what pleases me. So it's God's works versus man's works. There's no contradiction between James and Paul. And we can just conclude with a point from Hebrews 11 that we cited a little earlier. What do we see there when the Hebrew writer over and over again in Hebrews 11 says, by faith this person, by faith that person, by faith Abraham, by faith Noah, by faith Rahab, on and on down the line. Every time he says by faith someone, he follows it by saying did something. By faith Noah built an ark to the saving of his house. By faith Abraham departed from his home and went to a country that God would show to him. Always, what God exalted as an example of faith in Hebrews 11 was a faith that obeyed what God said to do unquestioningly, even when it wasn't clear what that command involved. Noah never saw rain, much less a flood. Abraham didn't know where he was going to. He'd never seen that country. But God said, go do it. And they did it. And God rewarded them. So when we look back at Habakkuk, what Habakkuk was teaching the inhabitants of Judah at that time that he was so worried about, God, we are enmeshed in sin. Why aren't you doing anything about it? Well, I'm going to. I'm sending the Babylonians. Lord, how could you do that? How can you use them to punish us? God says, I'll take care of them because they're proud, they're arrogant, and they trust in their own gods. All you need to worry about, Habakkuk, is that the just shall live by faith. So our lesson from Habakkuk and the quotes of Habakkuk, the teaching that we find in his use in the New Testament, is that one thing, that command is a promise. In Hebrews 11 or Hebrews 10, the passage that we quoted, he talks about receiving the promise which is written in Habakkuk. The just shall live by faith. So that's a prophecy from Habakkuk. And it's a promise to us. A life of humble and trusting obedience to God demonstrates our faith in Him. So this teaching is always relevant, whether it was 2,600 years ago or 2,000 years ago when it was written in the New Testament, or when we look at it today. When we struggle and we consider the violence and the ungodliness and the idolatry that we see around us in our society today, rest assured, God will do what it takes to deal with that. He'll judge it. But the just shall live by faith. So that promise is to all of us. That's the good news. That's the heart of the gospel. It's not our own power. It's not our own wisdom. Or it's not by whatever God that we might set up in our hearts to follow. We'll be saved by our faith in Jesus Christ. If you have not sought to express that kind of faith, if you've not chosen to follow Jesus Christ, but you're interested in doing so and you want to learn more about what's involved in that, how do I become a person of faith? How do I live by that faith? What do I need to do to demonstrate that faith? One reason we are here is to help you do that, to help you find the answers to those questions. If you've grown weak in the faith, if for whatever reason you're stumbling and losing your strength, you're discouraged, remember that promise from God. The just will live by faith. Let us help strengthen your faith. Draw near to God, and He'll draw near to you. Whatever way we can help you to do that, we want to encourage you to let us know. We sincerely want to do whatever we can to help you find Jesus Christ. Consider that, and let us know what we can do to help you while we stand and sing.